Welcome to Gothic Ledger, where we don't just tell stories, we exhume them, where truth is buried beneath sealed records, and family is not always what it seems. Tonight, we unseal a file that has haunted investigators, social workers, and survivors for decades. It begins, as these stories often do, with good intentions and a perfect photograph. This is the macabre history of the Fings, a couple who adopted 12 children over 15 years. None of them had birth certificates. What began as a tale of charity and second chances would slowly unravel into something far colder, something structured, ritualistic, and deliberate. Before we begin, subscribe to Gothic Ledger and turn on notifications. Our investigations are never weekly, only when something buried demands to be seen. The town of Milbrook, Pennsylvania, was the kind of place you'd expect to forget time, not to lose people. Just under 3,000 residents, 1 post office, 3 churches, a town where doors were rarely locked, and everyone knew whose casserole belonged to which grandmother. But in the spring of 1978, the Fings arrived. Howard and Margaret, smiling, quiet, generous. They moved into a house that had stood empty for decades, an aging Victorian on Elm Street. And from the outside, they looked like salvation. Inside, they were preparing something else entirely. I came here the first time out of obligation. I come back now because something won't let me stay away. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's something quieter, older. You're standing at the edge of what used to be the Fowing property. Milbrook calls it a garden now. Raised beds and community plots. Benches made of reclaimed wood. Children come here on field trips to learn about composting. They never mention what this place really is. Beneath your feet, there's a foundation, and under that, there's still something deeper, something that hasn't been unearthed and maybe never will be. Back in 1978, it looked different. Then again, everything does in the beginning. The house on Elm Street had been empty nearly a decade. A rotting Victorian tucked behind old oak trees, windows boarded, porch sagging like a broken jaw. Local kids dared each other to get close, swore they saw things in the upstairs windows. For years, no one touched it. Then the Fowings arrived. Howard Falling, an investment banker out of Pittsburgh, the kind of man who ironed the inside of his collars, polite, punctual, always left the exact right tip. Margaret, his wife, had been a pediatric nurse, or so she said. She carried herself like royalty, all pearls and pressed linens. When she smiled, it never quite reached her eyes. They were the kind of people who appeared in church bulletins and fundraising galas. Their arrival was the kind of good fortune towns like Milbrook aren't supposed to get. They moved in quietly, bought the house outright, spent a small fortune restoring it, turrets cleaned, gables repainted, stone lions flanking the front steps again like they'd never left. People were charmed. Howard joined the Rotary Club. Margaret baked for every school fundraiser. They hosted wine tastings, donated a pipe organ to the chapel, offered their land for the autumn harvest fair, and then came the children. James W., as the first, a baby boy announced like a miracle. No one asked which agency. No one saw paperwork. He just appeared. Bright eyes, pale skin, a strange kind of stillness for an infant. Then came Elizabeth, Thomas, Catherine, William. By 1985, they had 5 adopted children, all under the age of 6. By the end of it, they had 12. 12 adopted children, not one with a birth certificate. There were whispers, but not questions. In towns like Milbrook, people don't question good fortune. They praise it, explain it away. Margaret claimed she homeschooled them, said public school would be too disruptive, too secular. They learn better here, she told the pastor's wife. We protect them from the noise of the world. They didn't attend birthday parties, never joined the Scouts or Little League. No one ever saw them ride bikes. The children moved in tight groups, always in matching clothes, always within an arm's reach of Margaret, and always silent. I remember one photo from a church picnic, Margaret standing behind all 12 children, her hands on the shoulders of the 2 oldest. Every child is looking straight ahead, blank-faced. No one is smiling, not even Margaret. The house was pristine. The lawn always mowed in perfect diagonals, fresh paint every spring. Margaret's rose bushes bloomed in blood-red rose by the fence. People praised their generosity. They're saints, one neighbor told the local paper. To take in that many children, God's work. But no one could answer where the children came from. Every time an agency was contacted for verification, the trail ended. Closed files, fires, transfers, disbanded offices. No consistent story, no legal origin, 12 adopted children, and not one had a birth certificate. The question hovered over the town like fog, thick, unspoken. We told ourselves they were lucky, that the children were lucky. But luck doesn't erase identity. It doesn't scrub every trace of who you were unless someone wants it to. And the FO, they wanted something clean, something obedient, something that wouldn't remember where it came from. They adopted 12 children, and not one had a birth certificate. They never let the children out of sight, not even to make friends. The house was beautiful. That was the first thing everyone said. Polished wood floors that smelled like lemon oil. Lace curtains always freshly pressed. Portraits in gold frames, even the ones with no names. It looked lived in, but nothing ever moved. Not the rugs, not the books, not the air itself. When Margaret held James, she held him like he might disappear. Even at church, she wouldn't pass him down the pew, not even when he was just a baby. One woman recalled reaching to touch his hand once, just his hand. Margaret shifted so fast you'd think the child had been in danger. "He's very sensitive," she said with a smile that never bent at the corners. That sensitivity became an explanation, a shield. Anytime someone asked why James wasn't in the nursery, why he never played with the other children, Margaret would answer softly with that same steady voice. "He's delicate. We're being careful." And then came Elizabeth, then Thomas, then Catherine, then William. Each time the church welcomed them like new flowers in spring. There were parties, quiet ones, photos with tissue paper streamers and single cakes with neat lettering, but no guests, no friends, just the fowling children seated in a row, not speaking, not touching their plates until Margaret nodded. Someone once asked if James could join their son's scout troop. Margaret laughed gently and said, "He's too advanced for that." The explanation changed, depending on who was asking. Too gifted for public school, too anxious for playgrounds, too spiritual for birthday parties. But always it ended the same way. No thank you. By 1985, there were 5 children under the age of 6, all adopted, all withdrawn from the world before they could enter it. The town chalked it up to good parenting or old-fashioned values or wealth. Wealth always bends the rays. Margaret claimed she was homeschooling. She had the credentials after all, a pediatric nurse with years of experience. "I know what they need," she told one mother over tea. Children flourish in order. Order became a religion. Each child had the same haircut, the same posture, the same strange stillness. They spoke only when spoken to. They blinked too slowly. They didn't ask questions. In photographs, they always stood by height, oldest to youngest, arms at their sides, eyes on the camera. James stopped smiling around age 4. The rest never started. There were no scraped knees, no pencil drawings on the fridge, no swing set in the yard. A neighbor once swore she saw the children kneeling in the backyard after sundown, hands clasped, heads bowed, silent, motionless. She didn't mention it until years later. "I thought it was just a prayer circle." She said they were a religious family, but no one could say what church they belonged to. It was easy to believe in their perfection because it was easier than questioning it. They gave generously. Margaret baked for every bake sale. Howard wrote checks for every cause. And so the town returned the favor by keeping its distance. Behind those doors, the Foying house became a sealed system, a world unto itself. The family grew, but so did the wall around them, and the children stayed silent even when they learned how to speak. He didn't cry, not even during emergency surgery. It happened in the summer of 1987, a perfect Sunday afternoon. Children laughing somewhere nearby, lawnmowers buzzing in the distance. Inside the falling house, it was quiet. Thomas had fallen from a tree in the backyard, a clean break gone wrong. The bone had pierced through the skin, compound, jagged, unmistakable. But Margaret didn't take him to the hospital. She laid him out on the kitchen table instead. Neighbors later recalled seeing her hands covered in blood, though at the time they thought it was paint. Margaret the nurse, Margaret the mother, calm, controlled. She sterilized her tools in boiling water, wrapped the arm in gauze, and whispered something soft. But when she tried to set the bone, It snapped again, and Thomas stayed silent. He didn't cry, didn't flinch, didn't scream. By the time Howard overruled her, days had passed. The boy was feverish, his skin pale and burning. They brought him to Milbrook General under cover of night. No ambulance, just Howard's black sedan pulled up to the emergency bay without a call ahead. Dr. Sarah Chen was on shift. She would never forget what she saw. Septic shock, infection creeping up the arm, emergency surgery required. The bone had begun to die. But that wasn't what struck her most. It was the stillness, the way Thomas looked to his father before answering even the simplest question, the way he followed Margaret's every movement with his eyes, not fearfully, but obediently. When Dr. Chen asked for medical records, Howard produced none. He said they'd been lost in a fire, that the adoption agency no longer existed, that the boy had always had a weak immune system. When she pressed, Howard offered to transfer Thomas to a private facility, said he didn't like the tone of her questions, said it was better if they didn't feel scrutinized in their own town. Dr. Chen filed a report with Child Protective Services that same night. The investigator assigned was David Morris, young, courteous, thorough on paper. He visited the falling home 3 weeks later. Margaret met him at the door in her Sunday best. The house gleamed. The children sat at the table reciting verses. Thomas's arm was in a sling. He smiled when prompted. Morris wrote, "No evidence of abuse or neglect. Home environment is clean and structured. Mother reports anxiety around hospitals due to childhood trauma. While her decision was unwise, it does not indicate malice. Case closed." Dr. Chen was reprimanded privately by the board for overstepping, for suggesting something that could damage the reputation of a respected family. Thomas returned home, no follow-up scheduled, and so the silence continued. But for those who were listening, it had changed. It wasn't just silence anymore. It was fear, the kind that lives beneath the skin, the kind that doesn't need to cry to be heard. There was a girl in the third-floor window, one no one had ever seen before. Susan Fletcher kept journals the way other women kept recipe cards, precise, doe-geared, stored in stacks by date and scent. She'd been a social worker for nearly 15 years when they moved to Milbrook in the winter of '92. She told herself it would be quiet here, safer for her daughter. The falling house was only 4 doors down, a landmark in its own way, larger than anything on the block, towering and trimmed in red ivy that never seemed to die. The kind of house people referred to in shorthand. The big one with all the adopted kids. At first, she kept her distance. New neighborhood, new rhythms, but old instincts don't rest long. Her first note was dated the 9th of January. Children always walk in a straight line, never speak, never break formation, no physical contact between them. She called them the line. They passed her window twice a day, always at the same hour, always flanked by Margaret. Susan had seen control before, but this was choreography. By February, she had started tracking them. When they appeared, where they went, who spoke, the answer was always the same. Nowhere, and no one. No school buses, no visitors. Margaret speaks for all of them. No external contacts. Her daughter Emily was 16 at the time, observant, curious. She watched from the upstairs window as James, the oldest, stood outside one morning, completely still in the snow, not shivering, not blinking, doesn't move until Margaret opens the front door, then walks inside like a signal was given. Susan tried to introduce herself, brought over cookies. Margaret smiled wider than anyone should, said the children were shy but deeply gifted, said they were not quite ready for new friendships. She invited Susan in for tea. The house was perfect. Gleaming floors, polished brass, the scent of something floral layered with antiseptic. But Susan noted the locks, one on each bedroom door from the outside. There were noises too. The 14th of March, heard soft crying from 3rd floor. Margaret said it was the wind. The 22nd of March, girl in the 3rd floor window, long black hair, gone before I looked again. Margaret insists it was Catherine, but I've met Catherine. That wasn't her. Susan stopped sleeping. She sat in the guest room with binoculars, scribbled notes in the dark, drew the layout of the house from memory. Michael, her husband, was a journalist. He had started writing about adoption frauds in the region. Agencies shut down. Children misplaced, paperwork forged, patterns emerging. He never mentioned the Fowings by name, but the timeline fit too closely. The missing records, the sealed files, the fire that supposedly destroyed their adoption agency. By spring, Susan knew. She knew there were more children in that house than had ever been named. She knew the house itself was keeping secrets, but she didn't know how many or how long it had been watching her back. The 3rd of April, Margaret stands at her bedroom window for 23 minutes, never moves, never looks away. The 5th of April, I feel like I'm being observed. Not just watched, recorded. Susan kept writing, even when it stopped making sense. Even when the lines blurred between what was outside the house and what had started living in her dreams, the entries became more frantic, more afraid. But always beneath the fear, there was certainty. There was a girl in the 3rd floor window, one no one had ever seen before. Each adopted child came with a silent twin, another child who vanished nearby. The box was waiting in the attic, not labeled, not hidden, just sitting in the dark, exactly where she'd said it would be. Susan Fletcher died in the summer of '95. Cancer, quick and merciless. But before the end, she made one final request. She called for Detective Richard Cooper, young then, new to Milbrook, green enough to still believe some institutions could be salvaged. She handed him a key and a promise. Read it all. Don't stop halfway. Inside the box were her notes, not a journal, a dossier, typed transcripts, Polaroids, maps hand-drawn in pencil, labeled by child height, and the angle of known windows. Margins crammed with annotations, dates, times, temperatures, what the children were wearing, how long they stood still, every entry precise, every detail documented, and then the connections. One file per child, one child per disappearance. Each of the 12 falling adoptions coincided with a child reported missing in a neighboring state. Always a child without a paper trail, a foster child, an undocumented immigrant, a runaway. The names were almost gone from memory, but not from record. Tyrone W., Lutia D., Alex P. No confirmed link, no closed cases, no DNA on file. But the timeline fit too perfectly. Every time the Fings adopted, another child in another state simply stopped existing. And Susan hadn't stopped there. She traced financial records. Howard Falling made generous donations to each agency they worked with, always within weeks of a finalized adoption, always just under the threshold that would trigger oversight. Cooper went further. He pulled tax filings, property deeds. He found evidence of short-term holdings, cabins, lake houses, private rentals, places the Fowings had bought and sold within months, all in counties with lax reporting standards, all near adoption, in agencies that no longer existed. But what chilled him most was the trust fund. Each falling child had one set up by Howard, locked until the child turned 25. For conditional access only if they remained in contact with their adoptive parents, only if they didn't seek their biological families. Control disguised as care. The kind of legal constraint that no one questioned, because on paper it looked like love. Cooper began taking notes in his own spiral-bound ledger. He didn't file them with the department. He kept them in his glove compartment in a locked drawer under his mattress. He stopped sleeping because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You start hearing the silence in places where children should be laughing. You look at old church bulletins and see a family smiling too tightly. You find photographs from the Harvest Festival, Margaret in white gloves, Howard in a blazer, 12 children behind them in matching sweaters, their faces turned slightly away. You notice that the same girl appears in 2 photos, taken 5 years apart with the same haircut, the same height, the same expression, and you realize it's not the same girl. It's the same role. The names changed, but the pattern stayed. Each adopted child came with a silent twin, and no one ever asked what happened to the other one, because no one wanted to believe they were missing, just forgotten. She never saw the children, but she heard them crying, singing to themselves. It was snowing when Cooper found her. A rusted trailer on the edge of a wooded lot in Ohio, the kind of place people disappear to, not from. Maria Vasquez opened the door with hesitation in her eyes, thin, older than her years, and already halfway through closing it again. He didn't say he was police, didn't mention the Fowings. He simply handed her an envelope. Inside, a photocopy of Susan Fletcher's handwritten notes. Maria went still. She sat down without being asked. She started shaking, and then finally she spoke. "I thought I imagined it," she said, until I saw her handwriting. She'd worked in the Foying house for 6 months, hired through a private agency, paid in cash, never signed anything. The rules were simple. Clean the rooms, don't speak to the children, don't ask questions. The 3rd floor was off limits, but Maria was asked to leave food trays outside 3 doors 3 times a day, always the same amount. No noise in return except they sang. She whispered at night in whispers, songs I didn't know. It sounded like children trying to remember lullababies. She never opened the doors. She never saw their faces, but she heard them cry when the house was quiet. She said Margaret referred to them only once, called them the fragile ones, claimed they needed solitude. That isolation was therapeutic. Maria said it wasn't solitude, it was containment. One night, she found James standing in the hallway. He couldn't have been more than 11. He wasn't crying, just staring at the wall. She asked if he needed help. He didn't respond. Later, Margaret told her James had been punished for speaking during dinner without permission. The punishment was to stand in the corner all night, no sleep, no movement. Margaret would check on him hourly. If he slouched, she would whisper scripture and start the count again. Maria packed that night, left before dawn, changed her name, told no one. "I was afraid of what would happen if they knew I disagreed," she said. "Afraid they'd put me up there, too." She told Cooper everything she could, every hallway, every locked door, every scream that was quickly muffled. But some things she couldn't say aloud, some things she only mouthed. "I think there were more," she whispered, "not just the 3. She said it like someone speaking into a confessional, not to confess guilt, but to release a burden that had poisoned her blood for years. Cooper didn't press, because by then he didn't need to. He already knew what was behind those doors, and whatever it wasn't sleeping. They were found waiting, sitting upright on their beds like dolls already dressed. The air was still heavy with fog when the unmarked vehicles rolled up Elm Street. No sirens, no shouting, just the dull crunch of tires over gravel. It was just after 5 a.m. the 23rd of October, 1995. They came with a warrant signed at the state level, pushed through by someone who still believed what was written in Susan Fletcher's file. They didn't knock. The door opened before they reached it. Howard Falling stood in a silk bathrobe, tie already in place beneath the collar, calm as if he'd been expecting guests. He said nothing, just stepped aside. Inside, it was silent, too silent. No crying, no footsteps, just breath. The team moved in fast, one group for each floor. The first thing they noticed, the children were awake, all 11 of them, already dressed, sitting at the edge of their neatly made beds, eyes forward, hands folded, not blinking. One officer would later write, "It felt like they were rehearsing for something. When questioned, they spoke in unison, flat voices, empty answers. Sir and Madam provide everything we need. We are safe here. We are happy." Even James, the eldest, gave the same response, word for word. Then they went to the 3rd floor. The doors were locked from the outside, nails driven in. It took a crowbar to get them open. Inside, bare floors, no furniture, no books, no light, just old mattresses stained and sunken into the boards, and 3 children, a girl, maybe 10, 2 boys younger. They flinched when the light came in, shielded their eyes, tried to crawl beneath the mattresses as if the fabric could save them. They did not speak. They whimpered. They pressed themselves into the corners of the room like animals that had already accepted what the world could do to them. One officer reached out, and the girl recoiled, covering her ears. She whispered to something in a language no one recognized. None of the 3 had names in the system. No birth certificates, no adoption records, no missing persons reports. They were on paper unmade. Ghosts. Howard stood downstairs, silent, unmoved. Margaret had to be restrained. She screamed in what later would be described as glossalia, a language of sound and faith and fever. She clawed at the officers, said they were ruining everything, said the children were almost ready. When asked later what she meant, she refused to elaborate. The children were separated, taken to hospitals, evaluated. The house was sealed. But long after the teams left, the scent of ammonia and dust lingered in the air, the sound of soft footsteps where no one walked, the echo of breathing in rooms long emptied. They found the children, But what had they already endured, and how many more had been there before the doors were opened? The filled ones sleep until Judgment Day. The journal was found beneath a loose board in the master bedroom, wrapped in linen, bound in red twine. Inside, nearly 200 pages of Margaret Falling's own hand, neat looping script with perfect margins and no corrections. Detective Cooper read it in a single night. By morning his hands were shaking. She called it the doctrine of refinement. Not a diary, a theology. It opened with scripture, but none that matched any known book. Verses warped just enough to fit her logic. Sin is not forgiven. It is transferred. Children come into the world either hollow or filled. Those filled with grace must be protected. Those filled with sin must be emptied. She believed in two kinds of children: redeemables, those she could train, shape, perfect, and vessels, those born with burdens not their own, meant only to carry the sins of others. In her words, some are chosen to walk clean because others carry the stain. The burden must go somewhere. I do not create the burden, I only move it. She described rituals, nights of fasting, circles drawn in ash and vinegar, small cups of blood placed at the foot of each child's bed. She never said where the blood came from. She never called it abuse. She called it cleansing. The journal was clinical in its cruelty. Detailed entries tracking progress. James recited all 66 verses without blinking. Elizabeth fasted 3 days and did not cry. Thomas still resist touch, maybe a vessel in disguise. Then the drawings, crude ink circles filled with stars and eyes, maps of the house with certain rooms marked in red, a calendar that doesn't follow the seasons, but a cycle of opening and draining. Beside it, a single line repeated 4 times: the vessel must not speak. While forensic teams combed the property, cadaver dogs stopped at the far edge of the garden. Beneath the rose trellis, 5 shallower graves. The remains were partial, small. None of the recovered bones matched the 12 known adopes. They belonged to children the state had no record of. Children never reported missing. Children who may have never been listed as born. Inside the graves, objects had been placed with each body. Small cups, broken rosaries, finger bones bound in red thread. One child was buried with a hand-painted mask covering the face. No eyes, no mouth, only a black star drawn at the center of the forehead. Cooper said it looked more like a relic than a crime scene, and maybe that's what it was. Margaret didn't think she was committing evil. She thought she was preparing souls, some for redemption and others for disposal. The filled ones walked in line, spoke when asked, prayed when told. The others, the filled ones, sleep until Judgment Day. 13 vessels for 12 redeemables. The math in Margaret's world had to add up. The trial was never televised. There are no sketches, no closing statements worth quoting because the real story happened in the margins. Howard Falling sat stone-faced in every proceeding. No visible emotion, no outbursts, no apologies. He never admitted guilt, only complicity. His lawyers argued he was manipulated, that Margaret's theology had overtaken the house, that he believed he was saving children from worse. But his signature was on every deed, every trust, every silence. He called it compliance. The court called it a plea deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Howard led investigators to 8 more burial sites, scattered across 5 states. Properties the Falling family had once owned. Briefly, quietly, a farmhouse in Vermont, a cabin in Tennessee, a ranch-style home in Arizona. No one remembered them ever visiting. Each site followed the same pattern. Shallow graves, small bodies, ritual objects, 13 vessels in total. The adopted children, the redeemables, were placed into protective custody, but most refused to speak. 2 disappeared within the first year. One was later found living under an alias in Alaska. When questioned, she simply said, "I don't answer to that name anymore." Margaret never stood trial. She was declared incompetent. Within weeks of the raid, housed at a psychiatric facility in upstate New York, where she refused to speak to anyone but the chaplain. She hummed mostly hymns no one recognized. Once she was overheard reciting numbers, 12, then 13, over and over. No names, just the count. When asked what the numbers meant, she said, 1 for each sin, 1 for each cleansing, 1 to hold the rest. She died 3 years later. No visitors, no obituary. Her grave is unmarked. The courtroom benches meant for victims remained mostly empty because the victims were never counted properly. Their names were lost before they were buried. And so they're remembered by maps, red pins, GPS coordinates, forensic files labeled by county and soil depth. They're remembered by place, by silence, by a ledger that will never truly balance. Justice arrived, but it came too late. And the children, most of them are still missing on paper, in memory, and in the system that failed to see them at all. If we'd waited just a few more months, Sophia would have been the next to be discarded. The tape clicks. You don't see her face, just her hands, nervous, trembling, pulling at the sleeve of a worn sweatshirt. Her fingernails are bitten raw. The voice that comes is low, practiced, detached. "I remember the cups," Elizabeth says. "They were always warm. We weren't allowed to spill them. You drank and prayed. If you threw up, you had to clean it up before she saw." Her name was Elizabeth Falling. She's 32 now. She's been through 5 treatment programs, 2 suicide attempts, 1 changed name, and she's still searching the room as she speaks, looking for something invisible, or maybe for someone to tell her it's safe now. Dr. Moruro, the trauma specialist who evaluated the survivors, speaks over a montage of pencil drawings and confiscated notebooks. "These children were never allowed to be children," she says. "Their idea of identity is fractured. Authority is conflated with survival. Obedience was life. The notebooks are filled with illustrations. Beds without pillows, bowls with black liquid, eyes drawn into the margins of every page." Elizabeth stops talking when you ask about the upstairs rooms, but her drawings don't. She draws Sophia, the youngest of the undocumented 3. Sophia now lives with a foster family in Oregon. She doesn't speak. She screams when someone closes a door. She can't sleep if the windows are open. But she survived. Unlike Catherine, who died of an overdose in 2008. Unlike Thomas, who vanished from a halfway house in Indiana. Unlike James, who walked into a lake one winter and never came out. There were 12 children. 9 are accounted for. 3 have disappeared. Some changed their names. Some disappeared intentionally. Others weren't strong enough to outrun what had already claimed them. Cooper kept track of them for a while. A spreadsheet at last known addresses, arrest records, medical evaluations. He stopped after Elizabeth's second attempt. "Survival," he once said, "is not the same as salvation." The 3 undocumented children, Sophia among them, were eventually identified through a long-lost court petition and a surviving aunt who had once filed a missing persons report in Arizona. The aunt never knew where her niece had gone, never knew what had happened until she received the call. They were reunited last year. Sophia didn't recognize her, but she held her hand, and that was enough. The rest of the children, their shadows, living between systems. Some attend church, under new names. Some live in motel, write poems on the backs of receipts, and some stare at walls, waiting for Margaret to reappear. Not because they miss her, but because they were taught that without her, they weren't real. And the tragedy isn't just what was done to them, it's that no one ever came sooner. If we'd waited just a few more months, Sophia would have been the next to be discarded, and we never would have found her. Sometimes the monster isn't in the closet. It's the family next door baking pies and writing checks to charities. It begins again in the garden. Where the house once stood, there are now rows of vegetables, sunflowers, and 25 young trees. Each tree marks a name. Some known, some only guessed. Detective Cooper walks the edge of the plot each week, slower now. He's older, grey at the temples, shoulders a little bent. He stops at each tree, sometimes touching the bark. Some were buried, he says quietly. Some walked away. None came out whole. The town of Milbrook rarely speaks the name Foing anymore. Officially, the property was resoned. Unofficially, people cross the street when they pass by. The scars remain. So do the questions. After the journal surfaced, researchers began to trace Margaret Falling's so-called doctrine of refinement. Not just the rituals, but the roots. Her writings mirrored fragments of obscure esoteric theology, ideas pulled from Gnostic fragments, apocryphal scripture, and a long-defunct movement called the Hollow Path, believed to have existed quietly in southern religious circles during the 1942nd. Margaret's mother, it turns out, was part of a commune in Louisiana, one that practiced redemptive suffering and used children as symbols of generational sin. It was never proven, just suggested through faded letters, one damaged photograph, and a handful of testimonies too fragmented to hold in court. But Margaret didn't need a movement. She built her own with matching clothes and locked doors, with doctrine disguised as mothering, with silence mistaken for order. The journal's final entry was found just before the last trial transcript closed. "I have kept the house clean. I have kept them separate. The burden has been distributed. The work is complete." Victory in her mind. Not remorse, not doubt, just order. The case reshaped several state laws. Regulations on private adoptions tightened. Foster oversight increased. A federal task force was formed to monitor faith-based childcare collectives. But the warnings weren't always heard. Not in time. Because evil wasn't monstrous in Milbrook. It was ordinary. It wore cardigans and organized food drives. It brought cassoles. It offered babysitting. And it never raised its voice. The surviving children, those who've surfaced, don't speak publicly. Cameras are avoided. Names are changed. Lives are lived in shadow. But once one of them wrote a single line on the back of a therapy form, she said, "If we did it right, we wouldn't remember the bad parts. That's how we'd know we were clean." Cooper sometimes still visits schools, speaks at trainings. He tells them not to ignore kindness that feels too rehearsed, not to dismiss perfection that never bends, and always ask to see the paper trail. The house is gone, the myth is not. And 25 trees still grow, rooted in silence, reaching for light.